Good afternoon. My name is Luke Nguyen. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Petro Yatsek program for the study of Ukraine. So last time we had a session on the military situation in Ukraine was with Andrew Bowen in July. At that point, things were very different. They looked like, Russia might be winning the war. There was sort of almost looked like the beginnings of a frozen conflict. But since then, we've had a tremendously successful counteroffensive by the Ukrainian army, which almost certainly motivated the what Putin has called a partial, in quotation marks, mobilization. So today we're going to talk about the military situation in Ukraine with two experts. First, we have Carl Scott, who's an independent consultant who served as a pilot in the Royal Air Force, departing his service in 2016 as an Air Commodore. From 2011 to 2016, he was based in the Russian Federation as the UK Defence Attaché. He served 10 years in the UK Special Forces, and he was decorated with the Air Force Cross for gallantry and made a commander of the Order of the British Empire for his work in Russia. He also holds the French National Defense Medal Echelon d'Or and has served Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Iraq, Kuwait, and Afghanistan. Next, we have Yuri Zhukov, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and a research associate professor at the Center for Political Studies at the Institute for Social Research. His research focuses on the causes, dynamics, and outcomes of conflict, drawing on spatial statistics, mathematical computational modeling, and text analysis. He has recently created a very relevant database, the Violent Incident Information from News Articles database, otherwise acronym of VINA, appropriately so. So very memorable. Okay, so to start things off, I want to talk about Russia's mobilization, and show a couple of videos, which, or at least one video, that this is from near Khabarovsk, which doesn't show a particularly positive view of what's going on here. We have, this is from apparently a draft office near Khabarovsk, Vladivostok.
Кантимушка, смотри, это кавалеровский военкомат. Тут менты. Подожди, я не тебя снимаю. Почему не меня? Ну подожди, я снимаю военкомат. А меня как снимать? Вот он я, блядь, на передовую едем. Вот
So he's saying that he's about to go off. We're going.
Вот мы в таком состоянии, все в таком состоянии, ребята едут.
So we also, there are also we have, on Twitter we have videos of people, setting fire to draft board offices and the like. So I'll start with you, Carl. I mean, obviously you have partial information, but what's your sense of how the mobilization is going?
The appearance from the media, as far as we can see, is that it's not been at all popular. It's drawing very heavily on those areas which have already submitted quite a lot of soldiers, less than entirely willing, to the Russian Federation Armed Forces in Dagestan, Buryatia, all these other places. So the burden is, as usual, falling disproportionately on those who are outside the major cities, those who are outside of really being empowered by the Russian state. That's obviously going to cause resentment. But what really strikes me is the regional variation within it. I spoke to a colleague in Moscow today who said it seems to be going remarkably smoothly, given how fundamentally unpopular it must be. I think what it comes down to is that regional governors are obliged to make quotas of people, and their political career is dependent on a successful outcome. Therefore, you're going to get some very disproportionate behaviours as people struggle to meet quite arbitrary figures for deployment of personnel. The one thing I would stress is what you get at the end of this isn't an army. It's possibly 300,000 additional hostages you can send into a war zone. So it's a very long way from being a meaningful military gesture. That would be my short view.
Right. So I've heard reports, I have no idea whether they're true, that this is, from Ukrainian sources, which this may well be informational warfare, but that troops are being sent with zero training. I mean, do you buy that? I mean,
yes, that wouldn't surprise me at all, having spent 5 years watching the Russians train. What they are doing nominally in practice is slightly different. But what they're normally doing is bringing back people who've had previous military training, theoretically giving them a quick couple of weeks refreshing, and then throwing them into trenches in a very First World War manner to hold a line into winter. It doesn't take a lot of training. If those people are highly motivated, if they actually served meaningfully when they were in the armed forces before, I don't believe either of those criteria are being met. So what you end up with is fundamentally an untrained group of people being pushed into harm's way. Very, very limited military impact, but there are major strategic and political impacts downstream.
And of course, I mean, what we refer is that they've, you know, brought in people who have, in fact, have not been trained. Yuri, I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, there is certainly a disconnect in many ways between the mobilization as it appears on paper and as it was declared by officials. It was declared to be a partial mobilization, which is kind of like being partially pregnant. It's really much more of a phased general mobilization based on the text. There's one classified passage of it, not at a very high level, FOUO, that named a number closer to 1 million. In reality, there are no limits on how many men can be called up. And there's also been a disconnect on eligibility for mobilization. On paper, and according to Russia's law on mobilization from 1998, the people who are supposed to be called up are reservists, under 35 for enlisted, 50 for junior officers, 65 for senior officers in the first wave. And then it progresses as they go on. Eventually, you're getting 45, 50-year-old privates. In practice, they're rounding up a lot of people who should be exempt: students, IT workers, people with no military training, parents with 5 children, 60-year-old privates, people with exempted medical conditions. And a lot of this is because the people that are handing out these draft notices are employees of local military commissariats, voenkomаты, and they have slightly different incentives than the folks in the Kremlin. They receive a quota, and they have to fill it as quickly as they can, even if that means bending the rules somewhat. In some ways, this is actually similar to the old terror by quota system under Stalin, where Moscow would send a quota to the region, say, round up 10,000 Polish spies. If there are no Polish spies, you still have to meet the quota somehow. So you start rounding up first people with Polish last names, then people who look Polish, then pretty much anyone they can find on the street. And so the incentive of the military commissariats is to meet these quotas, and they just kind of assume that officials high enough are not going to be looking too hard at the details. This has created some resistance, and this has gotten a lot of coverage in the West. My sense is most of these protests have been quite small. They've been quickly broken up, with the possible exception of Dagestan, and that's a whole other can of worms that we can get into. But there have been mass arrests. About 1,000 people were rounded up in protests in a couple dozen cities over the weekend. Because a lot of this kind of breaks this perception in Russia that was happening, which public support for the military operation in Ukraine is in part based on the perception that victory could be achieved at low cost and quickly without the need for general mobilization. And up till now, they've relied on these half measures, offering generous combat pay for short service contracts, forming reserve battalions, relying heavily on force providers from outside the regular armed forces, like the National Guard, mercenaries. This particularly resulted in some auxiliary forces having very poor troop quality. It also allowed Russia, however, to partially make up for their numerical disadvantage. But right now, as you said, Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive exposed the limitations of that approach. And this is where we are right now. They've had to finally pull the trigger on general mobilization.
Okay. So do you have any sense of like how many of the, I understand sort of the local officials are trying to kind of meet their quotas. I mean, will all of these people, is your sense will go into battle, or are they going to be sort of some of them without any military experience will be sort of not necessarily be sent, or literally, as we hear from the media, or literally, is it sort of plausible that a student with 0 military training will be literally sent to the front lines? Does that sound plausible to you?
It depends on what. Sorry,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
So you're probably looking for a comparative with press gangs rather than something more contemporary. There was in the news today a 63-year-old with diabetes who'd been released and sent home again after 24 hours. So there's some kind of filtration. The fundamental problem that they're going to have is that unlike, say, the US, Canadian, UK systems, where people go to a recruitment center, then they have basic training, and then they evolve through a centralized training process to be standardized and then sent out different units. Traditionally, in the Russian armed forces, you're trained in unit. So these people are going to arrive in their units before they're in any sense competent. Now, I can't see a hard-pressed army officer turning down a bunch of students, because at least they're fit, young, and can be cudgeled into doing what they need. I can't imagine the elderly, the genuinely lame, being necessarily retained. I could see unit commanders just feeling they have to turn those away, but all bets are off, quite frankly.
Yuri?
Really, the only possible job for untrained infantry like this will be to use them in defensive positions to hold the line. And that's probably how they'll be used in the short run. I mean, potentially this will free up some Russian units for local breakthrough attempts like around Bakhmut and Avdiivka. But I do not see this turning into any kind of major Russian offensive, certainly not before the winter. I think in the long term, this does help address a critical shortage of infantry in the Russian military, potentially enabling a new spring offensive. I mean, a shortage of, especially, dismounted infantry has been a key vulnerability for the Russians throughout this conflict. You see, in past offensive operations, you've had these armored columns stretched thinner along main roads without any dismounted infantry to protect them. And tanks require infantry support, especially in urban settings and when seizing or holding terrain. And so this potentially makes up a shortage in that area. But for now, if troops are being sent to the front with, in some cases, one day or sometimes no days of basic training, the only possible job for them is to put them into defensive positions.
Right. And I mean, my understanding was that the Russian army was already having logistical difficulties, both commanding and supplying its existing troops. I mean, what does this do to the logistics, to have all these kind of people? Carl?
Well, clearly it's an additional burden, and the critical points in that are less those things which can be seized locally, the foodstuffs and the like, things like medical provision, competent officers. These are the real hub points which aren't going to be met even remotely. And to take the point that Yuri made, I think if you're looking at holding a line over winter, so you've simply got mass, which is a very traditional Russian approach to a military problem, create mass, leave it on the ground. It's not necessarily particularly competent, but it's there. That would allow you to draw more professional units out, gather logistics for the spring offensive, retrain, allow some respite for those who've been in there 6-7 months, getting hammered for 6 or 7 months. I mean, that creates a tremendous opportunity, one could argue, for Ukrainians if, weather, winter, all those other things permitting. You would have an awful lot of people to push your way through, but those people won't be in any sense well provided for, from basic provisions, accommodation, leadership, medical supplies. It's a very, very fragile way of holding a line.
Right. So Vladimir Dubovic asked a relevant question here, which is, I think, so far, and I'm contributing to this, the mobilization has been treated with a lot of derision and sort of almost as a joke, these drunken soldiers going off and the like. I mean, but should we be taking it more seriously as a potential threat or game changer in any way in the conflict? Yuri?
It's a commitment device, much like the referendums. This is a way to burn the bridge behind you and have no choice but to push forward. And so on a political level, it is certainly a game changer. I mean, whether they can actually capitalize this is a separate question, because ultimately, Russia no longer has the same kind of Soviet-style force structure where it's oriented around mass mobilization of conscripts. So there's been a series of reforms that were implemented after the Russian-Georgian War 2008, where Russia tried to shift away from that model toward a smaller, more professional, more flexible force structure. Those reforms were very unpopular. They were never completed. And as a result, Russia was left with this hybrid of these two systems, kind of a smaller force of contract personnel that are potentially well suited for limited contingency operations, which could potentially be expanded with conscripts in the event of a large-scale war. But if that large-scale war happens and mobilization never happens, then Russia is left with a potentially quite serious manning problem. So right now, that's pretty much where they still are. I mean, the early indications are that some units are not ready to accommodate the inflow of personnel. Insufficient housing, not enough beds, soldiers sleeping on the floor, draftees are being told to bring their own underwear, their own socks, even maxi pads and tampons for first aid, for wound care. There's no heating in some of these units. And in one case, I saw a video where they were handing out uniforms from 1992. There's also the problem of basic shortage of officers and senior enlisted personnel to train the new troops. Many of these people are already on the front. And I think the reports of people being sent to the front after no basic training is just indicative of that. There's not enough people to do the training for them.
Thanks. Carl, what's your sense? Is this, should we be taking this more seriously than some of the coverage has been so far?
It's very easy for us to sit back and say these people are not professional soldiers. These people constitute no real threat. Would you want 300,000 armed, angry men from Siberia in Ontario right now? Yeah, put it in perspective. It is bloody dangerous. And what's really dangerous is when it fails, rather than if it were in the very unlikely event that it would succeed in some sense. Because a number of Russians are already referring to this as Winter War II, when they struggled very badly to achieve anything against Finland. The feeling was then that that conventional force failure against Finland led to Barbarossa and the German invasion of the Soviet Union. They're feeling now that their conventional deterrent credibility is catastrophically undermined. It's an act of desperation more than anything else, but it's a dangerous one on many levels. Politically, it does, once you've done a referendum, you can put anybody you like on your home territory. You can claim there's a nuclear umbrella over them. All of these other things bring to bear. Most importantly, it buys the population in. If it's necessary on the part of the Ukrainian forces to kill a lot of Russians, and that seems like an inevitable outcome, then this will become a more general war. The argument within Russia that this is about NATO, this is about Europe and America fighting via its proxy in Ukraine, that narrative suddenly is getting more and more credibility within the bulk of the population. And it already had a surprisingly large amount of credibility. From here, it sounds farcical. Not so invested.
Yeah, I would just add that I mean, a lot of hay has been made about these newly mobilized personnel coming in with lower morale than the average contract soldier. And of course, we're already seeing this in a lot of the cell phone videos of mobilized civilians. And part of this is just the initial shock of leading civilian life and understanding the reality of the Russian army and the conditions in some of these units. But we have to keep in mind that historically, command structure in the Russian army was designed to compensate for poor training, for low morale, and for, frankly, military illiteracy among many enlisted troops. So this is why their system does not rely on small unit initiative or sophisticated comms like it does in the West. Highly centralized command and control, centralized heavy weapons, concentrate all the complex gear in one place, typically at the battalion level, rather than dispersing it across multiple companies. And this simplifies supply and maintenance. It also compensates for incompetence of enlisted personnel. I mean, the downside is obviously you have a less flexible, less adaptable armed force, which is inexperienced and manned by less capable troops. But the upside is that this is cheap. It maintains unit cohesion, not in the way that we understand it in the West. I mean, it's not talking about primary group bonds here. It's talking about simply preventing desertion and disintegration. It does that job. And so this is a way to use Russia's quantitative advantage to compensate for a lot of qualitative disadvantages that they have. And we should not underestimate Russia's ability to cope with a low morale force.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. I just want to briefly talk about sort of the, of course, we've seen also hundreds of thousands of people, mostly a lot of young men leaving Russia. I mean, is this all typical after a mobilization? Or is this going to have any kind of impact, or is this kind of such a small share of the population that it's, it's not really important for the conflict?
Well, the view of the president of Belarus was that it was an insignificantly small number, but he's not necessarily renowned for being caring and compassionate about his own people. Yeah, there was already something of an exodus with an awful lot of good people heading for Istanbul, heading for Tbilisi, heading for any alternate they can come up with. And that will continue. It would be far more helpful, one would suggest, if these intelligent, young and highly motivated people were to remain within the Russian state. And eventually we'll see an evolution in Russia rather than they're leaving it, abandoning the problem, but it's inevitable. Is it precedented? Well, it's hard to say, because this is the first, in the sense of the new Russia that emerged at the end of the 80s, early 90s, this is the first time it's been attempted. It doesn't strike me that it's going to be terribly successful, but it's the wrong people leaving. It's the people that society needs for the long-term health and growth of its polity.
Yeah. Yuri?
At times of mass mobilization and drafts, young men flee the country. It's not a uniquely Russian problem. And in fact, this is why Russia's own law on martial law has measures in which the Russian president has the authority to prohibit Russian citizens from leaving the country, prohibit people from moving to a new address, restricting the ability of people to freely travel within their country. I mean, what we're seeing right now is not formally the announcement of war against Ukraine, or not a formal declaration, no formal invocation of military law, but essentially they're almost there in all but name. And so this is, I think what we're seeing right now at the borders, this is anticipated by Russian authorities, and they're already putting in place measures to prevent that flow by putting checkpoints on the border in which they're handing out draft notices to young men who are trying to flee. And certain border checkpoints with Georgia and Kazakhstan have already been closed. They're placing armored personnel carriers to block some of those exit routes. So I think they saw this coming, and this is very much this is on their radar.
Okay, thanks. So I want to turn to something you mentioned, Yuri, which is this impact on sort of these minority enclaves such as Dagestan. I mean, one must think that Kremlin is not simply worried about the war in Ukraine, but also the possibility for another kind of minority insurgency such as we had in Chechnya in the 1990s. I mean, so what's your sense of the? Start with you, Yuri. What's your sense of the sort of impact that this of the mobilization on the sort of ethnic tensions within Russia?
It's potentially problematic. So anecdotal evidence so far is that quotas for some minority regions are disproportionately high. So officially 1% of the eligible military age male population is being mobilized, but in one Dagestan town with a population of 8,000, they already mobilized 100 men, which is closer to about 3% of the military age male population. And Dagestan already has the highest losses of any federal unit in the Russian Federation. I mean, officially, Russia admits to about 6,000 killed in action, which is significantly lower than Western estimates. But just by the official numbers, of these 6,000, 300 are from Dagestan, and another 280 are from Buryatia. These are disproportionately high numbers. And the people on the ground there are aware of this. And a lot of these protests have had a nationalist element to them, not in the sense that there's no Dagestani ethnic group. It's kind of like Afghanistan. It's a constellation of different groups with different languages. But there is this anti-Russian, anti-colonial sentiment that's there, where the basic sentiment is, why should we have to fight the Russians' war for them? We're already doing so much. And we have to keep in mind that 15 years ago, this is one of the most dangerous parts of Russia. There was an Islamist insurgency with near daily ambushes against police. That 23 years ago, Russia completely lost control of a lot of this territory when Shamil Basayev and other Chechen rebels entered some of these Dagestani villages and set up Sharia law. And this is all part of a much longer history of rebellion that goes back 200 years, and an equally long history of Russian repression, mass deportation, all the way up to and including genocide. People there remember this, and to think that the North Caucasus is now suddenly stable, this is a mirage. I mean, the stability rests on terror, rests on a police state that's right now in Chechnya and in Kadyrov, crackdowns on Salafi clerics in Dagestan, and many young men have also left the North Caucasus to fight for ISIS and al-Nusra, and that was a kind of exit valve, a pressure valve that relieves some of the pressure in this region. But for all these same reasons, I would say that the unrest that we're seeing in Dagestan right now is unlikely to spread to other parts of Russia. No other part of Russia has the similar type of long local history of unrest, because the police are scared of citizens of Dagestan in ways that they are not elsewhere. I mean, these are not the hipsters in Moscow who come out with clever posters for doing solitary vigils in front of the Ministry of Defense. These are people that could potentially kill you, and we've seen videos of them fighting the police. When police try to arrest protesters, the protesters fight back and grab those folks and free them from police custody. So this is potentially quite volatile, and I would expect to see some kind of concession from Moscow to try to put all this, put a lid on this. And part of that is the reaction of Chechnya, where initially the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov said that there would be no mobilization in Chechnya because they've already exceeded their quota threefold. Well, first of all, this is not true. People are getting draft notices in Chechnya, but also this statement created a lot of tension in Dagestan, and protesters have latched onto this, saying like, well, why should we get mobilized when in Chechnya there's no similar action going on? And so this has a potential to escalate, but I do think this will remain a local problem in the Caucasus rather than spreading out more broadly.
Right, although a local problem in the Caucasus is still a lot. And what's your sense, Carl? I mean, is Putin playing with fire by sort of stoking tensions within Russia? And what about Chechnya itself? I mean,
I think he is to some extent. Well, he is. I mean, part of the problem that he's having to contend with is if you're going to call up people who served in the military, overwhelming the military doesn't draw on white, Western, Russian educated men. It tends to draw on those areas which are economically deprived, which tend to be in Buryatis, Dagestanis, the Caucasus heavily drawn on. And the last time I was in Dagestan, in the Caucasus, almost 10 years ago now, you could feel the animosity towards Moscow. It's slightly different in Chechnya because their loyalty was being bought, and Kadyrov has his own unique position to play, and he's a beneficiary of it, but also a local dictator. The rest of the Caucasus, there's a huge sense that they gain nothing from Moscow. Moscow is simply there to lean upon them rather unevenly most of the time. So that's bound to be exacerbated. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out further. It's the Central Asian republics, I suspect, are the area that Moscow is going to lose most and will have the most precipitous effect in losing their loyalties with this activity.
Okay, thanks. And so I just wanted to, speaking of Kadyrov, talk a little bit about the structure of the Russian army, which is a little bit confusing. You have the Russian army, but then you also have Kadyrov's units, and then you have the Wagner, the sort of quasi-private contractors. Yuri, can you sort of talk about, I mean, is it to someone like me who studies some sort of older military history, this almost feels kind of medieval. Is that a fair characterization, or am I exaggerating?
Well, it's a modern twist on that. So I think one of the main effects that the mobilization is going to have on the Russian military is that it greatly simplifies command and control. Potentially, especially if it reduces reliance not just on the Kadyrovцы and the National Guard, but also on these forcibly mobilized troops from LDNR, as well as the Chivaka Wagner, the private military companies. So all these units are co-located in the same theater. Many of them do not answer to the Ministry of Defense in terms of their command chain. So particularly the National Guard and Rosgvardia and Kadyrov is part of that. So these units, first of all, are not designed for warfare. They have no tanks, they have no BMPs. They were originally meant to be used for rear area security, although they were increasingly being used to hold defensive positions on the front. Certainly, by far, the worst off were the locally mobilized separatist forces for the LDNR, which had the lowest quality personnel, the worst kit, and many of whom were actually then effectively were serving under the command of the Wagner private military company, essentially as cannon fodder. Now, all of this created a lot of confusion in the Russian command structure. It also created a lot of weak points on the front, especially lines that were being held by these forcibly mobilized LDNR troops were some of the areas where the Ukrainians had the greatest success breaking through. And so on one hand, I could see this mobilization simplifying the command and control by reducing Russia's reliance on these auxiliary troops. At the same time, we're also getting reports that the Russians are also mobilizing personnel in some of the occupied territories of Zaporizhia and Kherson to fight against their own government. Now here, I think, now this is an area that's going to be a real wild card, because here there really will be a need for something like blocking formations, like Zagrada Triad, or political officers and counterintelligence units to keep these people in line fighting. We should expect their kit and morale to be the absolute worst of any units in the Russian armed forces. These folks are literal cannon fodder. And so they're really only likely to be used for defensive positions where they don't have a lot of responsibilities and can be easily monitored. But they also serve an important propaganda purpose, which is essentially, look, the Ukrainians we liberated are now fighting on our side. And also, look, the Nazi Kiev regime is shooting at their own citizens. I mean, we should fully expect those headlines to appear in Russian propaganda. I mean, there may be some hope that by mobilizing some of these Ukrainian citizens, that the Russians might deter Ukrainian armed forces from aggressively shelling concentrations of Russian troops. But that's unlikely to work. I mean, from a Ukrainian standpoint, it does not matter whether people shooting at you are forcibly mobilized or not. They're not going to unilaterally de-escalate. And Russia probably does not expect them to. And we should expect them to have just a lot of Russian news stories about how the Ukrainians are killing their own. That's part of their purpose. And so while Russia is simplifying some command and control problems, they're also creating others. And so we should expect to see some continuation of this kind of chaotic situation that we've seen until now, potentially with some improvements on the margins.
Thanks. Carl?
Yeah, fundamental problem is they've never achieved the numbers they claimed. In that transition post-2008 into a modern armed force, which remained incomplete, what they have never succeeded in doing is making the conditions and the career in the Russian armed forces worth anybody really with a choice taking on. They've never had the numbers, therefore to make up the mass, you bring in these people. They're not soldiers, you just bring in these people. And yes, I mean, Yuri made a reference to police Strobitiony battalions back in the Second World War. The reason they were able to do huge human wave attacks is because if you turn around and went backwards, there were formations designed to kill you there as well. Therefore, by going forward, at least there was dignity in the way you chose to go down. It's a very, very regressive move. They started this with an attempt at high maneuver contemporary warfare, which was catastrophically mismanaged. They're now in the First World War somewhere. They're pushing further and further back as we go on. And that seems to be the gist of it. But as Yuri points out, the political and information warfare aspects of it become very complex indeed.
Okay. So now I want to talk about the Kharkiv counteroffensive, which really kind of certainly changed the perception of the war from one in which Russia was winning, essentially, to one, I mean, in which like Ukraine was winning. I almost kind of, perhaps in my more optimistic frame of mind, it almost felt a little bit like the impact of Stalingrad and the kind of perception of who was winning the war. That may be an exaggeration. During World War II, when Stalingrad sort of kind of created this perception that the Allies were beating the Germans. So I'll start with you, Yuri. I mean, what explains the sort of, I would say almost perhaps unprecedented success? I mean, certainly surprising to almost everyone who really saw this conflict as a kind of trench, frozen conflict. What explains the sort of the success of the Ukrainian effort?
So I would point to three, maybe four items here. I mean, first is numbers. Russia famously redeployed thousands of troops to the south. The First Guards Tank Army, for instance, was sent to Kherson. This left a lot of the auxiliary troops like LDNR holding the line. In some parts of the front, the Ukrainians were able to achieve up to an 8-to-1 numerical superiority, which is key for offensive operations, and they broke through the weakest part of the front. north of Balaklia. And Russia tried to send some reserves into the area, but they couldn't get them there in time. There's also the second item is intel failures. So the initial Ukrainian advances around September 6th apparently caught Russian troops by surprise. Now, Russian troops in Balaklia, they expected Ukrainian advance to actually come from the south, not from the north. They knew an offensive was coming. I mean, that part was hard to hide, but there was some mistaken assumptions about the main axis of advance and where it would come. Then the other item is command and control, a lack of a unified theater command on the Russian side. And also this problem, which has plagued the Russian military for many decades, which is that lower echelon commanders are afraid to communicate bad news up the chain. This includes information about how dire the situation is, about the need for reinforcements, about the quality of their kits, about the ratio of friendly and enemy losses, and the result is false optimism. Then, of course, there are supply failures. The terrain is problematic for resupply. Only about 3 available crossings across the Oskil River. And in recent months, Ukrainian forces have also been quite effective at destroying ammunition depots behind Russian lines. And all these factors combined contributed to what we saw around 2 weekends ago.
Carl?
Yeah, an excellent summary. Perhaps the only word I would add would be motivation. The guys that were obliged to die holding the line didn't necessarily feel empowered and part of that process. They weren't prepared to stand and make that final commitment. Quite right.
One interesting, Tom Warner has talked about a Potemkin syndrome, which is interesting, that the idea that the Russian army was engaged in these meaningless offensive activities to kind of, pretend work that didn't really have larger strategic value. I mean, to what extent, I guess the question is, to what extent are this phenomenon important in sort of the kind of low morale? Is it a problem that the Russian army on the ground may not want to actually care about winning, but just wants to sort of be seen to be kind of following orders and the like? Yuri?
Well, I think they certainly care about winning. The decorations depend on that. Promotions depend on that. Their well-being potentially down the road depends on that. And so I wouldn't completely write it all off in terms of covering their own behinds in the way they operate. But this is just more just symptomatic of how Russian command and control works. It's a lot of authority rests with higher echelon commanders. It's not like in the West where you're given the commander's intent, but you're told what to do, but not how to do it, and the rest you can improvise. That's more like the way the Ukrainians are operating right now. This is just the Russian way of war. You do not trust junior officers necessarily, and you're very conservative about the authority that you delegate to smaller units. I think this is just the comfort zone in how the Russian army has traditionally fought.
Okay, Carl. So we recently heard, that I have no idea how meaningful this is, but that according to the New York Times, Putin is getting more personally involved in the direction of the war. Never, I guess, for someone like me, it never seems like a good idea for people who aren't professional military to sort of start directing the war. And of course, it brings up images of Nicholas in World War I. What's your take on that?
Absolutely. And I think back in February the 24th, the whole operation began in precisely that light. It was being conducted on almost willfully misleading intelligence, because he was being told what he needed, not what was the truth and not what was actually taking place. And the planning and initial conduct of the operation showed no indications of having been conducted by the general staff, by military personnel. It just breached almost every principle of Russian military doctrine and training, even less good broad common sense. It felt like a political initiative. It was attempting something like Czechoslovakia 68. It was a special military operation, an operation carried out by the military on behalf of political leadership as a one-off event. he is now very much committed to it. I would be surprised if he was trying to run it. I suspect he's bringing in his better generals now, and his generals have had a lot of experience in Syria, in Chechnya, over the years. They should have accumulated experience and competence, and he appears to be ready to fire people, bring other people back in. That doesn't surprise me at all. I would be very surprised if he was personally overlooking the map board and saying, no, I want more troops here, more troops there, because that is always a huge failing, because it is complicated. And he doesn't seem to be meeting, at the moment, their own doctrine.
Yuri?
So there are a lot of aspects here that are reminiscent of World War II, and in many ways, from the Russian side, this is kind of like a cosplay of World War II. That's how they've sold it to the public. But also, part of this is reflected in the command structure. I mean, there are many cases during World War II where Stalin would insert himself into the role of corps commander or division commander and, move military units around on the map. So far, the main report I've seen of that was around Kherson, where Putin has told his generals essentially no step back, don't pull back across the river, hold this position, and that could potentially put the units there in a very precarious position as they're increasingly cut off from resupply, and as the Ukrainians are advancing, certainly from the north and from the west. But it's not clear to me that this is having that this is the case across the board. In part because a lot of the key battles right now, like around Bakhmut, that battle is being spearheaded by Chevaka Wagner. They're the ones that are currently they just captured the strategic heights on the eastern side of that town, and they're making steady progress in ways that the regular Russian army is not. And so I think if we see more and more examples of kind of the Putin direct control method failing and some of these more decentralized approaches succeeding, that may force a correction on the Russian side. But I think at this point it's too early to judge, and there's simply a lot we do not know about the deliberations within the Russian high command as of yet. I mean, we'll know in about 70 years when the archives open up, but I think most of us plan on being dead by then.
Yeah, thanks. So let's talk about the Southern Offensive, Carl. I mean, obviously we understand that sort of there's a far more well-defended positions in the south around Kherson, which is of course kind of a prize for both sides because it's the only major regional center that was captured after February by the Russians. I mean, what's your sense of the progress? And I mean, I've heard on that Twitter, I hear that you see these things, good news and coming in the next hour that Kherson's about to fall. And then we were told that, of course, Putin kind of had to personally intervene to prevent Russian forces in Kherson from surrendering. I mean, what's your sense of the progress in the south, Carl?
Well, if anywhere is the Russian main effort, and it's been very difficult to identify one so far, it's that south coast. And the initial idea was quite clearly about Novaya Russia. It was about taking back the south coast, Crimea, and leaving a rump Ukraine dislocated from its main lines, certainly maritime communication and trading. So that is always going to be an area which will be far more difficult to prize them out of. They've also got the opportunity of Crimea. So they have a place to fall back to. They have a large resupply logistic hub there. They've got some depth. Yes, they've got the Russian border on the other side, but I don't see them being quite so prepared to yield. And part of the problem, as Yuri mentioned earlier, in the northern and eastern part, was forces had been relocated to consolidate the south. That made it a very precarious and fragile line when the counterattack hit it there. Those forces are in the south, and if they haven't got anywhere to go, then I suspect, I mean, I don't have any real tactical level detail on how that's taking place, but I would suspect there's a far more entrenched defense taking place.
Yuri?
It's slow going. So last I checked, Ukraine is still advancing from several directions on Kherson, from the west on the M14 highway that connects Mykolaiv to Kherson. It's essentially it's slowed down to a crawl. Right now the Ukrainians are about maybe 20 miles from the city center. There have been taking very heavy losses, a lot of OSINT info on online with burned out Ukrainian vehicles and equipment. It seems like they're having a little bit more success up north around Davidov-Brod. And so there's some progress there. This is kind of closer to Novokakhovka than to Kherson itself, but it seems like what the Ukrainians are trying to do is potentially cut off Russian forces in Kherson from Novokakhovka and also capture a beachhead on the Inhulets River, which is up there. It's about twice as far from Kherson Center, though, as the frontline Ukrainian positions coming in from the western side. They've also been doing deep strikes against Russian military targets within the city of Kherson. But this is all, this is all standoff strikes. This is not an indication that they're any closer to actually capturing the town. And I expect with these reinforcements coming from mobilization, a lot of these units are going to be sent specifically to this theater to prop up Russian defenses there. It seems like the city of Kherson has become a touch point for Putin personally, and he does not want to see another embarrassment here like around Izum and Kharkiv. So this is gaining a disproportionate importance in Russian thinking about this war.
So, Carl, I'm assuming that the Ukrainians obviously know this, and then we have both the mobilization, but also the coming of winter. There must be a sort of real sense of urgency on the Ukrainian side to capture Kherson, before the mobilization can really have an impact and before winter sets in. Is that right?
Yeah, but judging when that will actually take place is an interesting question. How to mobilize and then put that many people into what is at the end of the day Ukraine. They have some time, I would suggest. What I would pick up on what Yuri said is, if this is a place where Putin is personally digging in as an area of special interest, that's a catastrophic weakness to play in. Stalingrad, as you mentioned earlier, was a key place where two very egomaniac leaders became obsessed with that battle, and it absolutely undermined military initiative on the more capable force. The high maneuver German force was sacrificed to one man's ego. If he chooses to go down that path, I'm sure he's getting advice from Gerasimov that says, understand your initiative and your need to do that, but it does not make military sense, and this is a military operation.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to maybe step back a little bit and talk a little bit about the sort of balance of military capabilities between Russia and Ukraine. One of the things that sort of struck me recently is that when we last talked to Andrew Bowen, I think there was a general consensus that, in terms of the balance of capabilities, that on the one hand, Russia had problems with personnel, but had huge advantages in supply. And in a sense, the Ukrainian was the opposite. They had, certainly better motivated personnel, but, huge problems in supply. But then we've heard sort of obviously reports that Russia has needed to buy North Korean artillery shells. And also they've begun to rely on Iranian drones, of course. And so I'm wondering, do we still, is that sort of assessment still the case, Yuri? Do we have a kind of, do you think that there are more supply problems on the Russian side than we perhaps thought?
Yes. Well, the Russians have faced supply problems throughout this war, and a lot of that is due to the fact that they're having to use these external lines of communication to keep their troops supplied, whereas Ukraine can proceed along the interior of the country, and they can move troops, they can move supplies much more readily, and also this also means a much denser network of logistics on the Ukrainian side that's much harder to interdict than on the Russian side. The effect of capturing at least the western part of Kupiansk was quite decisive on the Ukrainian side, because that was a key hub. But I think the overall balance of capabilities has changed in the sense that Russia will no longer be in the situation where they have abundant equipment but not enough manpower. Now they're going to have a lot of manpower and gradually declining quality of equipment in the average unit. Ukraine's advantages will remain morale. much higher than on the Russian side, but again, that's not necessarily the most decisive thing. Western arms and intelligence, a lot of op intel coming in from the West. Command and control, emphasis on small unit initiative, which gives an advantage over Russia. Certainly troop quality and specialized training that they're getting in the UK, as well as just simple Ukrainian ingenuity and adaptability. They're turning into increasingly capable force armed with modern weapons and personnel that can process intelligence and make good decisions very quickly. That said, the Ukraine is also very highly dependent on Western aid. That's a lifeline that can be cut off, I think, easier than we realize. And also attrition. There's a lot we do not know about losses on the Ukrainian side. Particularly several months ago in the Donbass, that situation looked really dire, where Ukraine was losing a battalion equivalent a day. Those losses would not have been sustainable. But Russia's advantages remain mass, a relative self-sufficiency in equipment, the way that Ukraine is not. They have a long-term numerical advantage in personnel, especially after mobilization. They certainly still have the edge in air power and naval forces. Of course, the disadvantages are ones we've already talked about. Low morale, the fact that these new or reconstituted units are going to draw on increasingly obsolete stocks of weapons, and logistics. And so it's yeah, so I would say, like in terms of the overall balance of military capability, it's a bit of a draw at the moment, but it's an unstable one. A lot depends on the sustainability of Western support.
Carl?
Yeah, I would just say on Russian capability, I'm not sure we were ever quite as deluded as might be suggested into believing they had large amounts of contemporary high technology, networked precision munitions or weapons available to them. We could summarize by just looking at the current state of the Russian Air Force and its deployment. You build the Su-35, you've got a very high-tech, apparently very capable new attack aircraft without the munitions, without the intelligence feeds, without the targeting to be any use whatsoever. And it was a report by the Center for Analysis of Strategy and Technologies in Moscow very recently that looked at their use of air power and said it's actually, in practice, for close air support is no better than it was in 1942. If I might steal a phrase from Alexander Dugin, who's quite popular in Moscow Kremlin circles at the moment, in Russia only two things are real: oil sales and theft. Everything else is a kind of theatre. And the modernization of their armed forces has been precisely that. We would go and look at the presentation of new equipment on Red Square, on the May Day parades, and there'd be new generation tanks, armored personnel carriers, which appeared to be made entirely out of plastic shells around traditional equipment. You'd see the latest 5th generation fighter, which was still running on the old engines because they haven't developed a new one for it yet and didn't have any of the weapons systems you need. And all the way through, it's been an outward-facing bluff, this Russian capability. They are coming back to a more honest position now, which is back to mass. If you can put thousands of artillery pieces, even if individually they're very imprecise, and just use mass in place of precision, perhaps that will work against them. The Ukrainians have very quickly and very sensibly made use of high precision with good intelligence feeds to hit command posts, to hit key points, to hit bridges, crossings. These things are a phenomenal difference to just blasting away at a built-up area in the hope of killing everything in it. So yeah, the Russians are creating their own resupply problem. But at the same time, I think what the Ukrainians are gaining instead, as long as the will holds to provide them with those munitions, and it's going to be an interesting winter, particularly in Europe, for that particular conversation, the Ukrainians have an enormous edge there.
So, Yuri, do you have a sense of like how much the Russian supply problem has been affected by the sanctions? I mean, people, obviously it's been a very hot topic. Some people saying the sanctions don't matter because Russia is still continuing the war, but others saying that the sanctions have mattered because it has hampered Russian military capabilities. I mean, do you have a thought on that?
To the extent that they're having an impact on military production in the defense industrial complex, I think we have yet to see those effects on the battlefield. So this is mainly going to be due to shortages of key components, microchips, things that the Russians cannot produce internally. Down the line, we may also see some problems due to interruptions in the flow of capital goods into Russia that can be used for military production. At the moment, they're managing with what they have, and I think if anything, mobilization is going to improve the situation on the Russian side by potentially converting a lot of civilian factories to military use. To the extent that that happens, that will make Russia even more self-sufficient in ammunition and some of the more basic systems. I would say that I wouldn't oversell the importance of modern systems in the Russian armed forces. They've had a lot of difficulty deploying those systems. I mean, we've seen some limited use of like Caliber land attack cruise missiles. We've seen some Buratino thermobaric rocket launcher used in the Donbass. But these systems have not been decisive. Per ordnance expended, cruise missile strikes have had a negligible effect against critical infrastructure. They're also not impeding the delivery of Western aid. They've not produced a major breakthrough in the Donbass. And so I think what ultimately is much more decisive is, good old-fashioned field artillery systems. And particularly the advantage that Russia has there has about a 3-to-1 advantage of the number of immediately available conventional tube artillery systems, about a 5-to-1 advantage, multiple launch rocket systems, and they're firing, at least they had been in the Donbass, around about 3 rounds for each Ukrainian round, as far as we can tell from open sources. Now that rate of fire also put the Ukrainians into a very unfortunate position, having to keep up with that, and to the point where they are basically out of the old Soviet stuff, running short on both ammo and barrel replacements. So that kind of fighting, basically a basic war of attrition, is something the Russians can certainly put back into action, and that is certainly that plays to their strengths, both in how they fight, but also in what they produce domestically.
Okay. Well, that leads us to the next question, Carl, which has to do with we've talked so far almost exclusively about the Russian side. I want to ask you about the Ukrainian military capabilities. I think we've obviously seen, I guess the word unprecedented is to use, but maybe it applies. Kind of provision of military assistance to Ukraine, which it was obviously been beneficial, but at the same time, a couple of issues rise. One is that I've wondered, you see this sort of almost a lost and found army, which is like these military equipment from a variety of different countries. So I guess the question is, how do you see Ukrainian military capabilities, and is it a problem that the army has had to sort of deal with multiple different systems on the battlefield, or is that an issue, Carl?
It's a relatively minor issue. Yes, it is an issue, but the beauty of the munitions that they've been provided with has been a very, very short training cycle. And a shoulder-launched anti-tank missile is, as is widely publicized, less than a day to train on. It's not a major obstruction. The more complex systems, such as particular air power, there's been a huge reluctance to give them, quite rightly, for various reasons, contemporary fighter jets, contemporary attack aircraft. They would take months, potentially years, to train to a full operational standard on. But they aren't being made available anyway, so it's less of an issue. And yet you have a ramshackle army. But one of the huge advantages with the motivation within Ukraine is that you are probably, and I'm only guessing because I've not been through Ukrainian recruiting stations, you're probably getting more intelligent, more creative, more resourceful people coming through the front door than you would if you were forcing a conscription in Buryati or somewhere where people don't particularly want to commit to it, and anybody who's got a job in IT isn't going to go and operate a military intelligence computer on your behalf. So I think that there's something about the personnel in Ukraine with that motivation, that mass mobilization there, which is undoubtedly helping that problem.
So you're speaking to this, you just mentioned that, is there going to, at some point, Ukrainians kind of run out of Soviet era equipment and have to make a transition to Western, weapons? Is that kind of, do you see that on the horizon?
Well, that tap has already pretty much run dry. Because early in the summer of the Donbass, Ukraine was just struggling to keep its artillery units supplied, having trouble delivering counter battery fire against the Russians, and that was having a huge impact on including facilitating Russian gains around Lysychansk and elsewhere. And so Ukraine was, by open reports, using 5,000 to 6,000 artillery rounds per day. So they pretty much used up their stockpile of the old 152 millimeter Soviet standard shells. Now this is an older, more unreliable munition. Their ballistic accuracy was limited. You needed to fire a lot more munitions to hit a target. And the same is also true for Russian artillery units as well. They saw the same equipment, but Russians just had a lot more guns and ammo. And also, like before I mentioned barrel replacement, but that is a huge problem for artillery units. I mean, you can only fire so many rounds out of the same barrel before the barrel becomes unusable, right? And the Ukrainians have no domestic replacements for the Soviet era 152s. So there's no domestic production. So now they have no choice but to rely on NATO standard 155 howitzers, and it's not clear exactly how many of those it has or how quickly it can replace them. I think the main risk here from receiving all these military supplies from all these different sources is that, well, first of all, there's the basic interoperability and comms issues, which are not insurmountable, but they are some startup pains. But I think the larger problem is one of maintenance and resupply. It's harder to get spare parts for what is essentially an army that basically an island of misfit toys, as some analysts have described it, the combination of very eclectic equipment on the Ukrainian side. But again, they're incredibly adaptable and quite ingenious in some of the adaptations that the Ukrainians have been able to accomplish in coping with the situation. Because when you have no choice but to push forward with this re-equipment with Western supplies and completely going out of the NATO standard, you're going to do it because your survival depends on it. So I think now we're moving past the stage where there's this awkward transition from Soviet to Western equipment, and now they've pretty much embraced this new model, and there's really no going back.
Okay. Do you have anything else to add? We're going to wrap it up, Carl. Well, thank you to both of you, Carl and Yuri. This is a fascinating discussion. And next, I will see you on October 11th. We're going to have a discussion about Zelensky's leadership with including a number of people who've written on that. And so I hope to see you on October 11th. But thank you both, Carl and Yuri.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.